remarked that several instances were not wanting in England of ministers having given up their places rather than comply with the wishes of the crown or act against her principles. That the King of England had considerable power over the army and the navy, but that over independent persons, not military, naval, placemen, or place hunters, he had only the influence which arose from their being conscious of the rectitude of his measures. And what more had I in France, said Napoleon? What could I effect unless with those classes that you have accepted? I venture to observe that in France there was neither liberty of speech nor of the press, and that a man might be clapped into prison for opposing the measures of government and kept there for an indefinite period. Napoleon replied, there certainly was not in France that freedom of discussion which prevails in England, though sometimes there was very strong opposition in the Senate. Nor was there so much freedom of speech or liberty of the press, but what could I have done to a banker or to other independent persons who opposed my measures? Put them in prison, vex and annoy them by arrestations. They could appeal to the Senate, add to the laws. Besides, it would have been an unworthy mode of acting. I do not deny that the old constitution of France was a very bad one and required to be newly modified. But that constitution which I gave them when I returned from Elba was excellent. Indeed, its only fault was that it left too little power in my hands, and perhaps too much in those of the Senate. Could not imprison a man without a decree, order a fine, impose taxes, or levy them by conscription, and there was a law for the liberty of the press. I said that his enemies had asserted that the constitution he had given was only for the moment, and that when firmly seated on the throne, he would have brought back things to the old system. No, no, replied the emperor. I would have continued the last constitution. I was well convinced that the old one required a great change. I suppose that it was Lord Castlereagh who made the assertion, but you must not believe Lord Castlereagh. You know what falsehoods he publicly asserted about me since I came here. I should not be surprised if they were to falsify all the political papers, as they have already done those concerning Murat and also myself. When I returned from Elba, I found all the apparatus. They had falsified a number of the state papers with the intention of publishing them. Monsieur Blacas had the direction of the whole, but it was a priest who managed and executed it. The same had been done before the Murat's papers. The fabrications were shown to some Englishmen. Blacas, in like manner, falsified a letter from the femme de chambermaid of my sister Pauline, containing 7 or 8 pages of bavardage nonsense. He had it interpolated so as to make it appear that I had set my sister. This Blacas is a wicked man and a blockhead withal. He was base enough to leave behind him at Paris letters containing the offers of all those in France who had betrayed me before, signed by the writers themselves. So if I had pleased, I could have executed thousands. I did not, however, make any use of them further than remembering their names. Now a greater proof of imbecility and of treachery could not have been given than this conduct of Blacas. Those letters ought to have been the very first things put in security or destroyed, as they compromised the lives of so many persons. But Monsieur Blacas was only intent upon saving his quattrini, and gave himself but little concern about the lives of those who had been the means of bringing himself and his master back. He was then minister of the king's household. Everything was trusted to him by Louis, who is incapable himself, and whose chief qualities are dissimulation and hypocrisy. His legs are covered with ulcers, which are dressed for him by the Duchess of Angoulême. He gorges to that degree every day that they are obliged to give him God knows what to enable him to disencumber himself of his load. Some morning he will be found dead in his bed. He has some ignorant imbeciles of physicians around him. They wanted Corvisart to attend him, but he refused, saying that if any accident happened, he might be accused of having contributed to his end. When I returned to the Tuileries, I found my apartments poisoned with the smell of his legs and of diverse sulfurous baths, which he was in the habit of using. These Bourbons are the most timorous race imaginable, continued Napoleon. Put them in fear, and you may obtain anything. While I was at Elba, an actress named Mademoiselle Raccour died. She was greatly beloved by the public, and an immense concourse of people went to her funeral. When they arrived at the church of Saint Roch, in order to have the funeral service celebrated over the corpse, they found the doors shut and admittance was refused to it. Nor would they allow it to be buried in consecrated ground, as by the old regulations of those priests, people of her profession were excluded from Christian burial. The populace broke open the doors with sledges, and perceiving that there was no priest to perform the funeral service, they became clamorous. Their rage knew no bounds. They cried, "Oh, Chateau, the Tuileries, to the castle, the Tuileries. We will see what right these priests have to refuse interment to a Christian corpse." Their fury was heightened still more by learning that the very coquin villain, the curate of Saint Roch, who had refused Christian burial to the corpse of Mademoiselle Raccour, had been in the constant habit of receiving presents from her, both for himself and for the poor, for she was extremely charitable, and had dined and supped with her repeatedly. Moreover, that he had actually administered the sacrament to her a few days before her demise. The populace cried out, "Here is the canaille of a priest who administers the sacrament to a woman and afterwards denies her body a Christian burial. If she was worthy of the sacrament, she surely is worthy of burial. He receives her benefactions, eats her dinners, and refuses her body interment." About 50,000 of them went to the Tuileries to seek redress from the king. An architect who was in the inner apartments at the time told me that he was present when Louis was first informed of it. Not being then aware that the mob was so numerous, Louis said, "The curate is right. Those players are ungodly gentry. They are excommunicated, and they have no right to Christian burial." A few minutes afterwards, Black Eye entered in a great fright and said that there were above 70,000 furious people about the palace, and that he was afraid they would pull it down about them. Louis, almost out of his senses with fear, cried out to give immediate orders to have the body buried according to the rites of the church, and actually hurried some persons away to see it carried into execution directly. He was not quit of his terror for some days. Those priests tried with me an experiment of a similar nature with the body of a beautiful dancer, but, per Dio, by God, said he with emotion, they had not Louis to deal with. I soon settled the affair. I, continued Napoleon, rendered all burying places independent of the priests. I hated friars, fratty, and was the annihilator of them and of their receptacles of crime. The monasteries where every vice was practiced with impunity, a set of miscreants, sclerati, who in general are a dishonor to the human race. Of priests, I would have always allowed a sufficient number, but no friars. I observed to the emperor after this that it had been asserted that after having at first refused to agree to the peace proposed by the allies at Châtillon, he had sent a messenger to inform Lord Castlereagh that he had changed his mind and was willing to agree to the terms which had been offered, but Lord Castlereagh had replied that it was too late and that they had determined upon their measures. Napoleon answered, "It is false. I never would consent to the peace of Châtillon, because I had sworn to preserve the integrity of the empire, rather than deviate from which. I wrote to Caulaincourt that I would abdicate. I would have agreed to the terms proposed at Frankfurt, where the Rhine was to form the boundary of France as being the natural one. I took the liberty to observe that it might naturally be supposed that he would not have adhered to the Treaty of Paris, the terms of which were worse. Yes, replied Napoleon, I would strictly have complied with that treaty. I would not have made it myself, but finding it made and that it was not of my work, I would have adhered to it and remained in peace. Part of the conversation which followed led me to make some remarks not favorable to Marshal Davout, and also to ask Napoleon whether he was not considered as one of the best of his generals. No, replied the emperor, I do not think him a bad character. He never plundered for himself. He certainly levied contributions, but they were for the army. It is necessary for an army, especially when besieged, to provide for itself. As to being one of the first of the French generals, he is by no means so, though a good general. I then asked who, in his opinion, now was the first. It's difficult to say, replied Napoleon. I think, however, that Suchet is probably the first. Massena was, but you may say that he is dead. He has a complaint in his breast, which has rendered him quite another kind of man. Suchet, Clausel, and Gerard are, in my opinion, the first of the French generals. It is difficult to pronounce which is superior, as they have not had many opportunities of commanding in chief, which is the only mode by which you can ascertain the extent of a man's talents. He also mentioned Soult in terms of praise. Went along with Captain Poppleton, Captain Fuller, Impet, and other officers of the 53rd to a rat hunt in the camp, which was conducted in the following manner. Some soldiers had been furnished with spades and began to dig close by a ditch and a wall which were infested with rats. 2 dogs were in waiting, and we were provided with sticks. As soon as the rats found their premises moving about them, they sallied out and endeavored to make their escape. They were then attacked by the dogs and men. And a most animated scene of confusion took place, the rats trying to get into other holes and the others pursuing and striking at them in every direction and hitting each other's legs in their eagerness to reach their prey. Some of the rats turned upon the assailants and made a desperate resistance. 14 of them were killed in less than half an hour. Now, rats are in number almost incredible at Longwood. I have frequently seen them assemble like broods of chickens around the offal thrown out of the kitchen. The floors and wooden partitions that separated the rooms were perforated with holes in every direction, the partitions being for the most part double and of 1-inch steel afforded a space between them sufficiently large to admit a rat to move with facility. It is difficult for any person who has not actually witnessed it to form an idea of the noise caused by those animals running up and down between the partitions and galloping in flocks in the garrets, whether in search of food or amorously gamboling, I know not. At night, when disturbed by their entrance into my chamber and by their running over me in bed, I have frequently thrown at them my boots, the boot jack, and everything I could readily reach without intimidating them in the slightest degree, to effect which I have been ultimately obliged to get out in order to drive them away. We amused ourselves sometimes in the evening by removing the pieces of tin which we had nailed over their holes and allowing them sufficient time to enter, when the servants, armed with sticks and followed by dogs, rushed in, covered the holes, and attacked the rats, who frequently made a desperate resistance and bit the assailants severely. However good the dogs may have been at first, they generally became indifferent or unwilling to attack those noxious animals. And the same may be said of the cats. Poisoning them was impracticable, as the smell of their putrid carcasses would render the rooms uninhabitable. Indeed, in more instances than one, it has been necessary to open a partition in order to extract the body of a rat which had died there and had caused an insupportable stench. The wretched and ruinous state of the building, the roofs and ceilings of which were chiefly formed of wood and covered with brown paper, smeared over with a composition of pitch and tar, together with the partition being chiefly of wood, greatly favored the introduction of those reptiles and was productive of another great inconvenience. As the composition, when heated by the rays of the sun, melted and ran off, leaving a number of chinks open, through which the heavy tropical rain penetrated in torrents. Countess Montellon was repeatedly obliged to get up in the night to shift her own and her children's beds to different parts of the room in order to escape being deluged. The construction of the roofs rendered this irremediable, as a few hours of sunshine produced fresh leaks.